Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch and myself chat to some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. And I am super excited about today's guest. We have Laura Montgomery, who describes herself as a space lawyer and science fiction author, here to talk to us about science fiction world building. I love science fiction. My father's paperbacks by like Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Ursula K. Le Guin. They were like the inspiration for me becoming a writer. So you are speaking my language. Laura, thank you very much for coming on the show. After Craig does your entry, you have to explain a little bit more about what space lawyer means. But hopefully you're having a very nice day. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. I'm doing well. I hope you guys are doing the same.
Absolutely. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland. And I'm excited as well. Thanks for joining us, Laura. You know, I'm also, like Roland, I grew up on science fiction. So it's science fiction and fantasy for me. So it's all about the world building, right? Which is really usually the biggest task of writing a science fiction or fantasy book is coming up with this whole new world that the people will live in and the new society that they're going to be a part of. And I think, you know, when it comes to writing, the various different genres, they all have different challenges. But to me, that's one of the biggest ones is that whole world building aspect. It can take so much longer to just do that before you even start writing, right? You got to figure out how your world's going to work. So yeah, tell us a bit about yourself and what Space Lawyer is and how you got started with all this, and then we'll go from there.
Well, so a space lawyer is someone who practices space law. And a lot of people think that just means the Outer Space Treaties, because people have heard that there's an Outer Space Treaty of 1967. But there are actually domestic regulations. So there's 3 regulatory agencies in the United States. The FAA, the FCC, and NOAA all regulate satellite launches, reentries, and satellite operations. I worked for the FAA for 22 years on launch safety regulations, so I know all about how in the United States we blow up rockets to keep them from hitting populated areas like, you know, cities, schools, other things we care about. And so I've learned a lot about that for someone who is a philosophy major. And I also worry about property rights in outer space and whether treaties are self-executing or not, which is a weird, arcane legal thing. But I've testified to Congress about that sort of thing. So it's been a really great, fun job. And my first science fiction novels were actually about space lawyers. So they say, write what you know, right? And so I did that. But
space lawyers, it sounds so exciting. Anything sounds more exciting when you put space in front of it, but like
lawyers in space, right?
Lawyers in space. So all of the legal ramifications of like space, it really is the final frontier of law, I guess.
It kind of is. I mean, it really incorporates all aspects of law, because, you know, you could have employment law concerns in space. We have waivers of liability. If you're a space tourist going up on a rocket, you have to sign an agreement you won't sue anyone. And really, when we say you, we mean your estate. So there's all sorts of different things involved in space law that, you know, a terrestrial law person could address. But
you know, all I'm thinking about is how often are rockets needing to be blown up before they hit a populated area?
Well, in the early days, it was a thing. And so we had, when I was at the FAA, we had to license a launch that was called Sea Launch. And it was totally cool, international effort using Boeing's money, Russian first 2 stages, Ukrainian first 2 stages, a Russian upper stage, and the big boat was retrofitted in Scotland, and they sailed through the Panama Canal, where they picked up the satellites in Long Beach, California, and then they went all the way out to the equator in Christmas Island, near Christmas Island, and they launched from there. And so you have all of these different aspects of that endeavor that you have to deal with. But the Russians, it turned out, didn't believe anyone would blow up that much money. So they have an automated system. A computer decides when to close the valves on the rocket, and it will drop like a stone from the sky. Since they launch over land, strangely enough, people have moved away from downrange of the Baikonur launch site. But we launch over the oceans where you are more willing to push the destruct button. So in the early days, it happened a bit because unmanned rockets have a 90% reliability. And that's not a number where you get on that airplane. So, because
Right.
10%
That's interesting.
failure-
90% sounds like a lot. You're right, but that's 1 in 10 doesn't make it.
Right. So in the early days, there was definitely a lot of that going on, where you would have to destroy the rocket. And with, newer untested vehicles, you want that destruct system on board.
Right. Wow. Lots to think about. So, okay. So how does this all translate into when you write your science fiction? What are you putting into this? Because I know that you and I had a bit of a conversation about this when we were discussing you coming on the show. And, to me, a lot of these issues are not necessarily issues that you would have to put into a sci-fi world building thing, because it depends on how different your world and your society is. Like, maybe we don't care about all those things, maybe it says alternate universe, or we don't have to care about them, or maybe you just don't really touch on stuff like that. Like, I don't remember reading any sci-fi books where they talked about issues like that, right? But I know that you put them into your writing, so you think that they are important. So let's talk about that a bit.
Well, so as you said, though, it depends on the context. So for near future science fiction, and I have one book called Manx Prize, where someone offers a prize to figure out how to deorbit large pieces of no longer functional space objects so that they don't form debris, because there is actually an issue and a problem with space debris right now. And so that I said about 50 years in the future, and I absolutely had to use space law of principles in there because it was, an extrapolation from now. And I don't think the treaty will be gone. I know there will be regulatory agencies telling people what to do. I was still at the FAA. So when I had the regulator, I just called it the regulator. I didn't say whether it was the FAA or the FCC, because for me, well, we don't know who's going to get on-orbit activities that aren't satellites. So I just couldn't get over that psychological hurdle of who the regulator would be, and I didn't want to say. So so we never know, but I sure know what a regulatory process looks like. So when our heroic team is trying to figure out how to deorbit a dead satellite, and then their competitors take them in front of the regulator. I put in the whole hearing and everything, so that that was one of those challenges our heroes faced. But so that was a lot of space law, and actually that's probably the most hard science fiction I've written, where I just kept pulling stories about dead satellites from space news and using them and their orbits and their parameters, because people who read hard science fiction don't want you making stupid stuff up. And I wasn't going to plot orbital parameters myself, because philosophy major. And so I used real ones, but I changed their names, of course. And that was useful. It worked. So my space law definitely showed up in that book in a big way. And in a book I called Mercenary Calling, I used, actually, I wound up using a lot of stuff about Oliver North, if you remember him from back in the day, and what kind of immunities he had testifying to Congress, because there we had
He was not necessarily involved in the most upfront things, was he?
No, but you had a legal issue that was pertinent to my story. And then The place where I've actually most recently put space law was a short story I did for a Baen anthology, Ross 248. And in that one, it's a shared universe where we were each assigned to write a story along a timeline that the editors had come up with. Humanity goes to this new star. These are the planets. These are the big events that happen. Write a story about one of them. So my main character was a space lawyer. He had come from Earth on the starship, and they found an alien artifact on the planet. And the very persnickety captain was like, well, can we go, look at it? It seems to be uninhabited and deserted, but what should we do? So the plot hinges around whether we apply the law of salvage, like for ocean vessels on the ocean floor, treasure ships, or we apply the law of fines, which is what happens on land, if you abandon something on land. And so I had a very amusing time of it myself writing that story, because I got to get little digs in on certain things that people think now. So so that one, it is, what would you do if you found an alien artifact? Can you just pick it up? Or does it belong to the alien? So
I think that's amazing. Yeah, Craig mentioned that there wasn't that much space lore in books. You get some hints of it, like in The Martian, for example. There's a whole thing of Watney,
pirate. Yeah, that's
yes,
wrong.
Space pirate. I'm fascinated. There we go.
But it was wrong. But he's brilliant, so we don't care. As Craig said, you kind of don't care. But we don't apply the laws of sea and space. We have space laws that we apply. So
I'm sold. I'm going to get all your books and read them after this. 2010 was another book I remember reading when I was a kid. I think it was published in the 80s. And of course, you had the Soviets and the Western world on a joint mission together. And so I guess there were debates that went on through that. I think it's fascinating though, but yeah.
Well, have you seen For All Mankind on Apple?
Oh, I've seen trailers for it, but I haven't seen the show.
It's really good, but I was so excited because they actually mentioned the Outer Space Treaty. So it was, they worked it in, and it added, good colorful background and gave you a feeling of verisimilitude. And the space lawyers in the audience went, "Yay!" So.
That's right. I guess we're kind of getting a little off topic because we were here about science fiction world building, but it seems to me that this very much is part of science fiction world building. It's like if you have space lawyers, they have to police space. And what does your space look like? You mentioned that you wrote a book set 50 years in the future. What does the world look? You had to build a world that was set 50 years in the future. How did you go about doing it? What did it look like? And how did you incorporate that in your story?
Well, I'm, as someone who's, what's the euphemism, a discovery writer, a pantser, I sort of found out as I went along, but it doesn't look too different from now. But there is a lot more activity in space. There's on-orbit activity. There are space tugs. There had been one of our main characters' father had been involved in a horrible space accident for a habitat. So I had us out to low Earth orbit and a little beyond, and then, but we hadn't gone back to the moon yet. So I'm hoping my prediction is going to be proven wrong with the Artemis project, but we'll see. So the place where I've had to do real world building is in my space opera, which is 1,000 or 2,000 years from now. And that's where I've got terraforming and a whole new culture to set up.
Now, and I think that the furthest you go is the more you have to do, right? We have to think about, how far, when you say 50 years in the future, which sounds like a lot when you think about it, but then you think, okay, well, 50 years in the past was the 70s, and how much have we really changed since then? I mean, sure, there's been change, but like, we don't have flying cars, we don't have a lot of like really big things that you think maybe you would have had. Our cities kind of look similar. We have taller buildings, but there's a lot that really looks the same. So in 50 years from the future, how much will it change? But then you never know what can change immediately. Like, if you were to write a book a year ago, if you were to write a book that wasn't set too far in the future, and you had this like crazy AI, you might be like, well, that seems unlikely because, you know, we don't have any AI like that, and that's not too far in the future. And then ChatGPT comes out, and all of a sudden everyone's like, well, AI exists now, right?
Yeah.
So that it could happen. It could happen really quickly. So it is. But I think, as you said, like when you write something 1,000 years in the future, all bets are off. You've got to like just reimagine everything.
Right. You're much more starting from scratch, as you say. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And that is a massive challenge. Fantasy authors have it as well, but science fiction authors have it because a story and a compelling book in the end isn't about the world it's set in. It's about the characters who live in it. And so how do you go around building this incredible world, and then you have to ignore so much of it because you're focusing on the characters? It's almost like Hemingway's iceberg method, where, you know, you only see the tip of the iceberg, but there is a whole iceberg beneath the surface. How do you even approach that when you're writing a space opera?
Well, you know, two things. You have to do a lot of work, and then you have to not do data dumps, no matter how much you want to. And so, but it's like it is the tip of the iceberg, or as you know, the Heinlein example everyone uses is the door's dilated, and then you know you're not in the present. And the other aspect is that I think there's an agreement between science fiction readers and writers that it will become explained as you read along. So you might start the book and it might be this very exciting scene where I remember one really fun book that I read a few years ago where our heroine is you know, trying to sneak through some asteroid belt, and there's a big spaceship nearby, and you know, she's trying to do crazy complicated things and that are very dangerous, and you're just like in there, and you know nothing about the rest of the world, but you know that it will be revealed to you. And then you will find out that, oh, she's not even in our solar system, and that these are the bad guys, and you have to layer in those basics of world building, especially in science fiction, because I don't know if you've brought me 10 years, 1,000 years into the future. I don't know if we're on Earth or a different planet. And I've read books where I didn't know that for half the book, and it was irritating. And so your reader will go with you for a little bit, but then they want you to start sneaking all that in. And they don't, without, you know, 6 chapters of the history of the world for the past 300 years, because that's boring. So so you do have to do that. And my 1,000 Years novel was sort of a discovery thing on the world building. I called it Sleeping Duty, because our space marine trapped in, you know, cold sleep on a lost medieval colony planet wakes up, and the king's not going to let him wake up his wife. And so, you know, it goes from there. So you have this sort of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's court kind of setup. But because we have you know, you say king, you know, that's different from what we've got now. And the guy was expecting to go to a terraformed colony world with his wife. And now he learns that he's been asleep for 300 years on this planet where starship got lost. Here they are on not what we were looking for, NULF for short. And so, you know,
I love that.
He has to figure out what's going on. And then so that's sort of where I created this like feudal society with, you know, socialist elements to it that was a very unfun place to live. And then, of course, after I wrote that trilogy, I'm like, how did we get to this point? And I start thinking, and and so now I'm working on a series, I'm almost done, called Martha's Sons. And that one is set 50 years after they find Nulf. And you've got your folks who are much more Western democracy types, and then you have the people from Mars who are not. And so there's a big culture clash there. And I have genetic engineering. So my main characters are Pan. They have antennae that were genetically engineered to make them stronger and see in the dark and all sorts of good stuff. But then they have horns curling back that cover the antenna and keep them safe. So they're the pan, and after that, it's there's the society, but I also knew as a gardener that soil health mattered, that you've got to have soil full of microbes and nematodes and protozoa and mycorrhizal fungus and all sorts of weird living stuff. And so so I got that in, but then I was also adding all sorts of plants that in my yard are super aggressive. And I'm like throwing them in, putting them in my book, etc. This is the perils of knowing something, but not enough. Because then I read a book called Bringing Nature Home, where this entomologist from the University of Delaware, Doug Tallamy, explains that 90% of insects have evolved to only eat one plant.
Wow.
Yes, this is why native plants matter. So this includes caterpillars that birds eat, all sorts of insects we like, as well as the annoying ones. And so you need to have all the pieces of your puzzle together. And you need to have the plants they evolved with so that they can live. This is why everyone plants milkweed for monarch butterflies. And so if you're bringing in plants from Brazil or Asia or wherever and jumbling them all up, the insects you bring might not work with them, might not eat. And so you would have a failed terraforming effort. So since I live in Maryland, I picked the Mid-Atlantic protocol, the Mid-Atlantic suite for my terraforming protocols. And I went back in my first couple books, I changed all the plants because I had wrong plants in there. But I'm an indie and most of my purchases are digital. So when I'm rich and famous one day, those paperbacks with the wrong plants will be collector's items.
Absolutely.
In my fantasy life. So I was like, okay, here's a terraforming theory. I'm going to use it. And I'm actually going to use it in my next series too. But so I went back and I retrofitted, and then going forward, I've got a terra seeder that has all of the soil life. And it's an object of much conflict. And so the whole incorporation of the native plant theory was sort of, this is great. I think it will work. And I firmly believe that when giant corporations go out and start terraforming barren rock worlds, that they are going to use this theory. They're going to get, well, if we're going to the equator, we better get a bunch of Southeast Asian plants and insects, and that they will work together. But if we're going to somewhere in a northern latitude at 30 degrees north, maybe we should use mid-Atlantic plants like I am doing. These are the plants I know. So it was really kind of fun, because I went from this sort of alien invader mindset in my fiction to now in my own garden at home, I'm planting native only. So it's now I'm on the home defense team, but it was kind of fun to come across this, because I knew in the back of my brain I needed a better terraforming theory than I had. But to find one like that was really, it was actually just plain old good luck, because I got a gardening email in the mail saying, come to this symposium. And I'm like, well, I don't want to pay all that money for that symposium. So I went and bought the book instead. And then I went and paid the $25 for the symposium because I needed to know more. So
there's so much that you have to really understand, when you write science fiction, or you have to be able to research, right? Like, that's not even stuff that I would have thought about. If I was going to write sci-fi, it would have to be sort of like near future, because I don't have enough base of knowledge to even know what I don't know, to be able to be like, oh, well, you got to make sure the plants and the insects are the right ones. Like, I wouldn't even think
that was me. That was me, even though I had some inkling and I sure knew about the soil stuff, but you don't know. But one thing that was really great about working for the FAA for so long was I knew a whole lot about launch. And so I stick things about launch to make it sound like I know what I'm talking about, into stories as necessary, including my one on the Space Force. But when I did Manx Prize, where you're deorbiting a giant satellite, bringing it back into the ocean, I knew how to research reentry, which is different. And so it was very helpful to have that background, because then I knew what I needed to look up next. And I also know rocket scientists who I could say, would you read this, please, and tell me if it's wrong? I did the first draft, but help me. So
yeah, you have access to rocket scientists that you could use for beta readers, so that works out perfectly for you.
It helped. They can't write it for me, but they can tell me what to fix. And right now I've got a former colleague from the FAA who's helping me with the very last airplane on Nulf. So he's been great, gives me all sorts of good ideas. But you need a pool of people you can turn to, as well as knowing how to research some of these odd things.
Yeah, I think that is key. I mean, if you were going to write something that is far enough in the future and it's not in your wheelhouse, then you have to have some kind of contacts in the industry, sort of, to be able to read it and say, yeah, this doesn't make sense. Or, I think a lot of authors sometimes do that. They'll send out emails to contact people in the industry that they want to write about, just to say, here's some. They don't have to necessarily read the whole book, but every time they want to write something that sounds kind of technical, or they want to bounce some ideas off of the person, to say, is this even plausible before I even get started, right? Then that's super helpful. And I think when you're writing sci-fi, especially, that's something you want to do.
I have found it helpful, and I'm sure that I'm happily ignorant of things where I don't know that I didn't know, and just sort of wave my way through something like that lost starship. I make no attempt ever to explain how the starship could possibly get lost, except, I mention a wormhole and leave it at that. And
sometimes that's what you need to do, though, don't you? I think there's a suspension of disbelief that you can just overcome if you don't focus too much on it. Don't try and explain the weirdness. Like in Star Wars, everything is like World War II airplanes, the way they're flying, which, of course, in space combat, it would be nothing like that, but it's part of the suspension of disbelief.
Right. And they don't explain faster than light travel to us, nor how it is that we don't have, relativity, when you can be on one planet and then you're going so very far away that all the people you knew would be dead and, when you get there, but they're not. They're up and battling evil. So it's,
and I think I apologize for my cat making a guest appearance. One of the challenges for authors who are writing science fiction for the first time is trying to explain everything. I worked with an author he was writing a book, and it started off with the protagonist launching into space in the rocket, and then as soon as he was saying, the rocket took off, and then he was like, the rocket engines were powered by this, and that enabled them to do this. And he wrote like 4 pages explaining how this was scramjet technology, which was different to regular rocket technology. And I'm like, I don't care. I just want to see him fly into space in a rocket. And so I can just assume that the eggheads at NASA figured all that out. So I don't necessarily need to be introduced into that in such a deep way.
Right. That's the data dump that can stall your story when you don't want it to. So
absolutely.
You could mention the scramjet. That's a thing that but you don't want to go on and on and on about it. I mean, my version of that is the blasters. I just don't try and tell you how they work. That is not something I'm going to go near.
I think that's a key point in sci-fi writing is the ability to know what you don't necessarily have to explain, what you can just gloss over and mention, and people will just accept it. I mean, even when you're writing hard sci-fi, I'm sure there's stuff that you can not necessarily go into. I think if you're writing, I think with space travel, I feel like there's like 2 camps of how authors go about it. Some of them will just be like, yeah, we're flying at light speed and assume everyone just accepts that's a known thing that they don't have to really. And then there's other ones that will really go into how their light speed works and how their stuff, and it really depends on the goal of your story. Is that something you really want to focus on? Is that,
well, if it matters to the plot, like all my terraforming stuff matters to the plot, because there's that's what the conflict centers around in the series as a whole. So, then you get to explain it a little bit more, but even then I don't try to explain it too much, and until the epilogue, there's a little bit more. But you have to watch it, because you don't want to lose the suspense, the momentum of your readers momentum.
Yeah, and you also don't want to take that chance that you'll say something wrong that will then really annoy everybody.
Yes, because people get thrown out of a story when they know better. I mean, nothing like talking to someone who knows about guns and they're like, well, it was a stupid book because they got this wrong. It's like, well, how was the rest of the story?
Yeah, but I mean, if you're the kind of person who's into that, it can kind of spoil things for you. You're like, oh, well, if the author got this wrong, then what else did they get wrong?
Right. You lose trust.
Yeah.
So if you can't talk about something knowledgeably, my rule is I don't talk about it at all. But if I can, I still try not to talk about it too much, because even though I'm all enthusiastic about it, that doesn't mean everyone wants to hear at length about nematodes. So,
I mean, that was one thing in The Martian, for example. They managed to go very quickly. It's like he wants to grow potatoes in space, but you can't just dig up Martian soil and plant potatoes and pour water on it. He needs to have that, and so they used the human waste that was there, and that was something I didn't know, and it was explained very briefly but very succinctly and made sense to me, and I was like, oh, there we go.
But he used it as part of, overcoming the latest obstacle he faced, and so that the whole process of growing potatoes, which, if I started telling you about it, you might find tedious, because it was a matter of life and death, suddenly became very suspenseful. And he did give us a bit of detail about it, just the right amount. Right.
Yes, just the right amount. And I mean, that's my question for you based on that is, okay, how much is the right amount? And secondly, for the sake of a story, is it ever okay, especially when you're writing hard science fiction, to maybe fudge things? Or what do you feel comfortable with in those situations?
Well, I think the big one that is totally okay, and that as a science fiction culture we have accepted, is faster than light travel.
Yeah.
We every scientist you talk to says, no, that's not possible. And it can't be done. But in science fiction, we happily accept it. It is one of the conventions that is okay. But for, I'm sure that inadvertent fudging happens, but I think especially if you say you're writing hard science fiction, you better do a lot of homework to make sure you don't screw it up. And that one really hard science fiction novel I wrote, Manx Prize, I spent a lot of time reading things and, trying to make sure I didn't have it wrong. The legal stuff, because the one hero is an engineer, a beautiful engineer. The other one is a handsome lawyer, and his stuff was easy. Her stuff was hard. So I did spend a really good amount of time trying to figure things out, because I didn't want to go ask my friends to figure it out for me. They wouldn't have done that. I mean, maybe they would have, but that's a big ask. So you try to figure it out, and then you say, this is what I think, and then they laugh at you, and then you go fix it. So
yeah, I think you have to know what is important to the readers as well. Like, I mean, like Faster Than Light Travel, I mean, it's a convention that's been around for so long, but it's also, without it, we couldn't really, if everyone's going to nitpick about it, then we couldn't really have most of the sci-fi stories that we have right now.
Exactly.
So people just have to accept it, whether they want to or not.
Right. So, and I think, even the most nitpicky of people will just accept it if they like science fiction, because they want their science fiction. So it is fiction.
Yeah, I mean, with Star Trek, another thing I always had a problem with, not a problem problem, but teleportation, right? Like, you know, they use their transporters to put you down and think. I personally I feel like, you know, when you're dematerializing somebody and rematerializing them, is that really still them? It's just a copy of them, right?
You're right.
That bugs me.
I share your concern. I mean, you just killed yourself, had yourself
Yeah,
killed.
right.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, absolutely.
Who's going to do that? I would never do that.
No.
You know?
No. And
Didn't there was a science fiction story, wasn't there, about how, you know, teleportation, it destroys you and creates a perfect copy at the destination, and then there was a science fiction story in which it didn't destroy the original, and there were two of them, and it's kind of like,
well, Star Trek did that. Star Trek,
yes.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there was Riker. There was like an evil Riker, and who got stuck in a pattern buffer or something like that, you know. And all of a sudden, they brought him out. It's like, oh, now we have two Rikers, right? And I think he still lives in that universe and comes in every once in a while, you know. Yeah.
And then, of course, you get into the ridiculous things of like, oh, if that happened to him, couldn't you just buff anyone? Couldn't you just go home every day and like back yourself up?
Well, exactly. And isn't that what they're saying is like, you know, we're going to transport you by making a copy and putting you down there. Why are you making a copy? Like, just, you know, put me on there, send the copy down, but I can just stay here.
Like, oh, I like that. That's perfect.
I'll take the day off.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But then you're killing that copy. I mean,
well, you don't have to, but then eventually you're going to have a lot of
otherwise,
the same person,
you know, you're everywhere. So,
right.
Or what's the Buckaroo Banzai line? Wherever you go, there you are. Gives it new dimension.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think stuff like that is, you know, you just have to sort of be like, okay, I know that it's not necessarily plausible, or I would never use it if it was, but I accept it because that's part of the show. And I mean, otherwise it's like the tedium of everyone having to get around on the shuttles all the time, you know, like you sometimes you're going to accept the things that are just going to make the story go a little easier and faster.
Right.
And I think in Star Trek, the whole thing of teleportation was specifically because of that. They didn't have the budget to film shuttles landing and taking off. So like, let's just have a device that does it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I read the same thing. So
yeah. So I mean, that's my feeling about what is acceptable and isn't acceptable in terms of like, if I was to try to decide, you know, what can I just gloss over or not, it would always be things I would err on the side of this will just make the story a lot easier if I just put this in, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. And I wouldn't try to explain it because you get it wrong. But at the same time, you know, what science fiction is, it's fiction, right? So you're still making stuff up that doesn't yet exist. So at some level, there's always going to have to be stuff you're making up. So even with hard sci-fi, you're still sort of, but you want to have it just plausible at least, right?
Yes. And you know, if you tie it to something that someone who knows more than we do about science has postulated, then I think that's a very legitimate approach to take. I think Kim Stanley Robinson's series, you know, Red Mars, he went and used Robert Zubrin's approach for how to get to Mars. He didn't just say, oh, they all got in this ship and there were no issues with anything. You know, he's like, okay, and then the water tanks are there to protect people against solar radiation. And, you know, so he used something that someone with the right background had come up with as something that might work. And it makes the story more real and more vivid because you're at least trying to do that. And you might not get into the level of detail that Zubrin did, but if you're using it, it feels right to the reader too.
Well, before this call started, you very kindly said that you enjoyed the articles I wrote, and I wrote that article about plagiarism, part of which was the fact that no story can exist in a vacuum. Stories are always built on other stories, and stories are built on things other people have written. So somebody writes a scientific paper about how they're going to use mold to soak up the radiation when you go to Mars, or I heard that somewhere, and it's like, then you can incorporate that into a story, and you have to take these components and put them together.
Right. They're building blocks, and that's not plagiarism. Those are ideas. You know, you're free to use all sorts of ideas, and so that's wonderful. Go research that if you're writing science fiction. You know, it makes it work better. But as opposed to saying, oh, you know, we all wrapped ourselves in Saran wrap, and then we had no radiation issues.
Will that work?
Yeah, that might get the book walled.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just like we can drink bleach to get rid of COVID, but whatever. If you if you think about it, like writing a sci-fi world is a lot, I think, more difficult than a fantasy world, right? Because the fantasy world, you really can just make everything up, and you don't have to explain it at all, right?
Mhm.
But even in like sort of non-hard sci-fi, you still have to have that basis in reality, otherwise it becomes fantasy. And I think that's sort of that difference, right, between science fiction and fantasy. Even light sci-fi, it's still, people just don't have magical powers. If they do, then it's fantasy. Like,
Right,
yeah,
right.
unless you can explain them in some sort of scientific way, which
Yeah, which would be really tricky with the Saran wrap, maybe. So
so how would somebody go about just starting to build a world? Like, let's say they wanted to they have this idea for a sci-fi story that they want to set really far in the future, like, and they don't have your kind of background. Like, where do they even begin to sort of build that world?
well, the far future one didn't really depend on my space law background at all. It was more, I'm a science fiction, fantasy, historical novel reader. And so I kind of pulled from all three of those genres. There's a part of me that in writing Sleeping Duty, sort of fighting against the fantasy trope that, oh, royalty and kings are good, oh, the true heir must reign, and all this. I'm like, no, kings always turn out bad eventually. Maybe the first guy's good and that's why he became a king, but his grandkid is not going to be so great to be around probably. So
Right.
I know that in terms of like the plot, there was a part of me that always gets annoyed at deifying kings and deifying royalty. So he was an easy bad guy to come up with, but even then I'm like, I knew that this guy had been trapped sleeping for 300 years, and so I knew that the background was a very technologically advanced society. And I know, even though I didn't write it into that first trilogy, that corporations went out and terraformed barren rock worlds, and that there were prohibitions against terraforming living worlds that already had their own indigenous life. But our guys are going to die. So they took one valley, they set fire to it, they sterilized it as best they could, and then they put in the earth they engaged the earth terraforming protocols. And so there's this sort of weird ethical dilemma backdrop going on too, and that troubles some of my readers. Well, they shouldn't have done that. Well, should they have died? You don't know. So some of it is for a pantser. I learn it as I go along. I'm like, oh, there was a second human settlement where the crew got sick of the people from Mars and went off and created another one very far away. And so, there's an element where it's like, well, how do you explain how your imagination works? I mean, I should ask you, what do you think? It's
Well, I think it's interesting that as a pantser, I'm a plotter, and to me, I can't even imagine writing like a far future sci-fi book without really coming up with a lot of that detail ahead of time, because I really have to understand how the world works, and I would be worried about getting things wrong, so I'd really want to plan it all out. So when you say you're a pantser, are you coming up with that stuff first and then just pantsing the story, or are you pantsing the whole world building too?
Definitely in that first trilogy, both. But in the current series, the prequel series, I've done a lot more thinking because I knew what happened later. So I did start doing a little bit more thinking about how we wound up in a feudal society, how the people who escaped it, how did the escape happen? And so I did have a very little teeny outline for the whole series. So I'm not pure pantser because I knew that this would have to happen and that would have to happen. And so I had certain goals to write towards. But I also I'd already made it up at that point by the act of writing the later trilogy. So, and then of course, midstream, I changed my terraforming theory, or I expanded my terraforming theory quite a bit when I learned that I should have this whole ecological puzzle piece working together, as opposed to the random approach I had taken for anything above the soil line.
Yeah, I often find it's one of the challenges. Yeah, I find one of the challenges of writing a series or a universe is often the first books you write are the books that have the biggest holes in them, because you're just starting out and creating something from scratch, and they get better and better as you write more books. But then when you get new readers interested in you, the first books they want to read are the first books in your series.
Sure.
So you mentioned one of the wonderful things about self-publishing and indie publishing and digital publishing is you can go back and retcon those things, whereas you never used to be able to do in the days of traditional publishing.
Right. And I do feel that retconning like a whole plot or changing a character or something, that's sort of something wrong with it. I'm not sure what, but I wouldn't do it. But getting fixing the plants seemed to me like a right thing to do. and I did do it. I'd written 3 books at that point, and there were no plant issues in the first book, but the second and third, I had to go back. So
well, we are approaching the top of the hour, so I think this might be a good place to wrap things up. But what a I've never spoken to a space lawyer before. I speak to lawyers every day, and I've never spoken to a space lawyer before. So, Craig, before Laura tells all our listeners where they can find all her stuff, do you have any final questions or thoughts?
No, I mean, I was fascinated as well. Like, this is just, it's always interesting to hear from somebody who has some of the background of this kind of thing and what their feelings are on this. I mean, sci-fi stuff and world building is just such a deep topic. We could probably go on for hours and hours about it, but hopefully this was a good sort of introduction to the idea for people. And, you know, maybe one day we can go in and talk about even some more aspects of it. But, you know, thanks for coming on, Laura, and telling us about this, because it really was interesting.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and it's great to get to meet you guys in person after reading all the Hidden Gems newsletters for the past number of years that I've been reading them. So really appreciate it.
Well, Laura, where can people whose appetite has been whet by listening to you find out more about what you do? Where can they find your books? Where can they look you up?
Well, my books are on Amazon in Kindle Unlimited. My short stories are not in Kindle Unlimited, so you can find them, you know, other places like Barnes and Noble and Kobo. My fiction website is lauramontgomery.com. And if you're interested in space law, I blog at groundbasedspacematters.com. You can tell I didn't know what I was doing when I came up with that name. And people who think I said grumpy space pirates are wrong, but it's actually groundbasedspacematters.com.
I immediately went there. I find that fascinating. And you know what, from an SEO perspective, that's great, because it explains exactly what it is about. Ground-based space matters.
Yes, because lawyers are ground-based. We are not space-based like satellites. So
I don't know. There are a few lawyers I'm sure that people would like to launch into space, but
you don't know how many times I've heard that. So.
Well, Laura, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm going to check out all your books and all of your blogs and things. Hopefully other people will do. So if you're listening and you fancy doing that, scroll down to the description of this video and you'll find a link to all of Laura's stuff. Scroll a little further and you can leave her a comment. Let her know how much you valued what she shared with us today. And while you're down here, if you haven't hit the button already, hit that subscribe button, the like button, that little bell icon, which is a notification for every time we have a new episode of Fully Booked. And we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. So until then, cheerio.